founder and CEO of Humanity Cash.
Hi, Fennie. Thanks so much for being on my podcast. I want to ask you first, just tell me about your career and how did you end up at a place where you wanted to start a company like Humanity Cash? And then I'll ask you about Humanity Cash.
So I've had a very traditional career track, and then I kind of fell off a cliff. And people ask me what happened to you. So my first job, I was working on Wall Street. I was, a credit analyst. I had to live through the whole financial crisis. So that's actually a very good window into, how I view things in the space I'm working in now. But subsequent to my time on Wall Street, I wanted to go back to grad school and study law, because I felt that was important to understand these structures in which we operate, markets or other spaces, and felt that was going to become important in the coming years, especially coming out of the financial crisis. But I just really did not like working for the man, so I did not enjoy working in those big companies. They often feel, you're not really building. And so there's that creative itch in me where I wanted to build something as well. And so that's what made me kind of jump off the cliff, going from, the big law firms and all of that kind of completely different culture to something totally uncharted. So from there's a career ladder here, you work your way up, and there's a pay grade every year, to complete abyss. I had learned accidentally about blockchain technology. I have a very funny story about that, where I got to meet Dread Pirate Roberts of the Silk Road fame in a federal prison in downtown Manhattan, totally accidentally through a friend of mine who was running a Toastmasters public speaking program at this prison in downtown Manhattan, where Ross Ulbricht, who was one of the original use cases for crypto, he started a dark web market where transactions were facilitated using Bitcoin. So that was sort of trying to wrestle with what's happening here with these ideas and this technology that at its core was about anti-law, or replacing institutional law with algorithmic law, if you will, right? The law of the algorithm, the law of code. So that was intellectually interesting for me, certainly as a lawyer. And I kind of went down this rabbit hole of, on the one hand, itching to be entrepreneurial and be able to create things, and the other part of it was trying to understand this phenomenon. And as someone with that legal mindset, trying to think, how do you operate something that is meant to be an outlaw technology within society that needs common rules, right, to operate. So that's kind of what brought me on this journey.
Wow, that's really fascinating. So I want you to describe for our audience how you define Web3 and or the associated technologies with it and strategies, blockchain and crypto. And then can you describe how Humanity Cash uses it?
Yes. So I think part of the problem is that we don't have good definitions of any of these things. And it's, in some ways, I think it is intentional, because you kind of want to define, the industry wants to define it in different opportunistic ways, whether it is to get regulatory arbitrage or some kind of other marketing hook. So different terms, some of them are adjacent, certainly, but not actually necessarily related. So if we start with just blockchain, right, and then there's all these different nuances, and people will, within the industry, will argue over all of that, and it's all very, life or death, existential, ideological arguments. So if we just start kind of, basics with blockchain, to me, it's a ledger. Fundamentally, the question is, how do we have a ledger of transactions whereby it is not just one authority that says this is the correct state of the ledger, the correct state of how the accounts between different parties are actually settled, and what's the correct state of those balances, and whether or not the transactions are valid ones. So the fundamental question is, if we don't want one entity managing that ledger, but we want it to be basically anyone, a whole network of computers that can manage the state, the authoritative state of that ledger, and to ensure that there's no fraud occurring whereby we are double spending money that we actually don't have, right? Because then that's how you break the integrity of that ledger. So that's really the fundamental kind of concept around blockchain, is that we don't like the authority of one entity that is the gatekeeper of the truth, right? Because they can censor transactions, etc. So we want the gatekeeper to be as many people as possible, provided that they follow a set of rules, right? Because now, if you don't have one entity that is a trusted entity, then we
government
need,
or a bank or something.
right, like a regulated entity that has to follow certain rules. And then there's, right, because the whole idea, remember, the genesis of all of this is to say, can we operate a system, a financial system at least, outside of a formal legal system? Right. And so to replace that, we're going to use game theory and economic incentives or disincentives. And of course, the idea of code, right, being using cryptography to ensure that transactions are indeed non-forged. But also importantly, it's not enough, right? You have to ensure that there's enough incentive for the entities that are monitoring the transactions and confirming the transactions to do that work, right? So you need to create an incentive. And so, these entities are sometimes called validators or miners, and they need some kind of reward for engaging that. But we also need to create disincentives for them, because they're literally writing the record. They're the ones that can cheat, right? So that, how do we make sure they also don't cheat, right? So there's punishments, or you have to compete with others in order to validate a block of transactions. So you might have to perform certain algorithmic tasks that require some resource investment, and therefore it would no longer be in your rational self-interest to try to fraudulently validate transactions, because then that would decrease the value of the reward that you're earning for keeping that ledger accurate. So that's really the fundamental core of where all of this starts, like, that sort of origin story around this whole industry, which is still prevalent in all these different aspects and how people speak about cryptocurrency, right? So cryptocurrency, to me, that's really like, you have a public blockchain where anyone can read and write transactions to that chain. So you need some endogenous economic incentive, right? So for the Bitcoin blockchain, it's Bitcoin. For Ethereum blockchain, it's Ether, right? You need to create your own endogenous cryptocurrency or token as the reward mechanism for maintaining transactions of that very cryptocurrency on its own ledger, right? So it's a little bit circular there. And now you expand that into Web3, right? Because Web3 says, okay, there's now, different applications that can be built on top of these transactional rails, but we kind of want to use the same principles around not having a single gatekeeper. We want kind of that sovereignty. Maybe it's sovereignty over our own data. It's a sense of ownership over the creation of whatever that we're, content we're putting out there, or whatever other kind of use cases, right? Here's a way for us to share data across many different parties that maybe we don't know those parties in advance, but here's a secure way of us sharing assets or information. So that's sort of where generally I would say Web3 comes from, and just to why Web3 versus Web 10 or something else. So and I guess in the broad history, and this is part of the narrative that the crypto industry wants to put on to kind of locate itself in history, right? So Web 1 was back in the 90s. You have your first hyperlinks. So the first ways for the public to actually interact with the internet computer. Web 2 is kind of the era that we're in now, and maybe it's the sunset of that era. You have the rise of all the tech giants that built huge monopolies, platform monopolies, on top of what was supposed to be a very decentralized. I mean, the internet is supposed to be that. It is that original decentralized architecture of different computers sharing information with each other and allowing anyone to be able to kind of listen in and contribute. But then, you know, you have your rails that might be decentralized and democratic, but then the business logic that is applied on top of that is heavily centralized, right? So what Web3 is trying to say, hey, we don't like these platform monopolies, tech monopolies, no, and not any more than we like big banks, right? That's the whole original kind of narrative for Bitcoin, for example. And so, hey, what Web3 says at the application layer, we're going to have an internet of value, and people can have self-governance, own their own data, and like with what Facebook is doing, selling your data, or, you know, part ownership and participating. Imagine if you were an early contributor of Facebook and you got, you know, little Facebook tokens, and now we'd all be rich, right? You know, for just being contributors to help them build that network in the beginning. So that's kind of the overall, you know, narrative of what Web3 is, or is attempting to be.
And so clearly there was something in that narrative that got you interested, because then you started a company that plays in this space. So what does Humanity Cash do, and how do you leverage these technologies?
Yeah, so I have to make a confession that I am a crypto skeptic working in the field, and there are apparently others like me. And when we find each other, it's like, is it safe to come out to come out of that closet? So I think for me, I've worked in, you know, a lot of these early projects, especially around decentralized finance or DeFi, and I'm like, wait a minute, you know, there is something interesting here with this tech, but I don't like how we talk this big talk around financial inclusion, but the structure is completely cynical and the opposite of that, right? It's there's no consumer protection at all. Like, we've completely gone backwards. And remember, I lived through, you know, that my first job was the great financial crisis. Like, oh, okay, this is why we have, you know, rules and laws and all this stuff that we think, you know, is just you know, meant to create monopolies. But like, so I'm like, well, how do we, you know, taking a pragmatic view, if this is going to be the future, then there's a responsibility that I feel like I have to come in and say, well, is there an alternative vision of where this technology can go that actually speaks truer to its original beliefs? Because remember, again, with Web 1 and Web 2, right, started off with democratic, decentralized rails, but then we ended up with very centralized systems and platform monopolies. And the same thing is already happening in crypto, right? Because it's a human nature problem. It's never a technology problem. And so do I say something here because I do have knowledge of how this technology works, to say, maybe let's try to see if we can actually make these tools a bit more accountable to financial inclusion. So at Humanity Cash, you know, coming out of experience working with digital currencies and something called stable coins, the idea of a stable coin is that it's acting as like a dollar proxy, so that you can transact with something that's very much like digital cash, right? So it has the value of a dollar or whatever is the national currency you're operating in, but it has but it's wrapped in this, you know, cryptographic layer so that it can move peer to peer, right? So to me, like, this is still the original promise of blockchain, is around the ease of peer-to-peer transactions, right? Being a digital bearer instrument and having cryptography serve as the mechanisms by which we ensure that the bearer instruments retain their integrity. And by bearer instrument, it means that whoever is the holder of an asset is the de facto kind of owner of the asset, right? So that works best in cases of money, of cash, right? In that, you know, you can make arguments that does have financial inclusion, because if you're unbanked, you still need access to money, and increasingly everything is digital, which requires you to have a bank account. But what if you could have a financial asset that is like cash, and that has the regulatory properties and consumer protection properties of a bank insured product without necessarily needing the whole thing of a bank account and maybe the expenses associated with that. So that to me was like kind of interesting. It's like, can I do something like that? And can I work with community banks and credit unions that are losing incredible market share to big banks and to fintechs, right? So we have an incredibly concentrated and centralized financial system. The four largest banks in the US account for almost half of all US banking assets and deposits, even though we have almost 10,000 community banks and credit unions. So can this technology be deployed in a way that lowers the barriers to entry for these community financial institutions to participate in this new, Web3 revolution in a way that is compliant and doesn't create undue risk, so that, we can have people making financial transactions with the ease of the internet, with the protections of the traditional banking world, right? But greater access and greater participation in all of that by these smaller financial institutions whose job really is to ensure that last mile liquidity goes to small businesses and otherwise underserved individuals.
Yeah, and there's a lot of resonance between what you're doing and things that I've done in the Web 2 era in terms of, wanting to build something that was community run, community owned, that intervened in a system where the big players have more advantage. So I think that's definitely a story that I feel like the crypto folks want to sell, but then actually when you look into it, it's like big VCs and it's like the same big money players. But I want you to talk a little bit more about this kind of promise of a decentralized community-run financial system, because I do think that that is what gets people excited about crypto when they learn about it. Because everyone's been, well, not everyone, but many people have been to that experience when you go to a bank and it's super impersonal and you get the sense they're not really trying to hear your story. A lot of people can't get bank accounts. They can't pass through all of the loopholes you need, the minimum balances, whatever you have. And then even globally, we're seeing crypto being used in places like Afghanistan, right? And in South America, where their local currencies have been devalued because of the global dollar, which is another kind of global supremacy, right? And so there's this promise of crypto to empower those who've been disempowered. So is that kind of what you see as well?
So yeah, let's unpack that, because I think a lot of the narrative is a bit cynical, or not quite cynical, because yes, there's dollar supremacy, but fundamentally, what does Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies do for the local economy and social and political cohesion of a place like Afghanistan or other places that are under duress? Like, certainly I think, yes, it's a stopgap, right? Like it's okay, like your national currency has totally collapsed, like anything is better. I mean, a lot of those places still prefer dollars. Like if you look at El Salvador, people still prefer dollars, and they've made Bitcoin legal tender there. And I think there's a lot of grift going on there, with the government and how they're deploying that, right? But so yes, I can hear some of the original sympathies around cryptocurrency. I was like, okay, if is this a tool when in distress that you could use, right? But is that the same tool that should take over in ordinary times and say this is somehow a superior ideological and social and political and technological solution? I think that's quite dangerous, because fundamentally, crypto it's like it doesn't see sort of that diversity of local customs, right? There's no room for it, because you have to understand the fundamental ideology that it's born from is to say we can't trust humans, we can't trust institutions of any kind, because institutions are run by humans, which is corruptible. So there's only room for the code, right? So if you're really going to be that crypto maximalist, you're going to say, even if there's a hack or a mistake, the code allowed for it, code is law. We can't, as humans, try to go back and redo the code and fork it and create, and try to get people's money back. You take the risk, what you're in for, that this is sort of the values, right? And so we're kind of moving from that. And then this is sort of answering your question. For me, I'm technology agnostic. I think it's a tool. It has to be just a tool. And all technology ultimately is in service of the sociological phenomenon, right? The zeitgeist that it's operating in. So it's going to be response to that. And for me, it's like, yes, is there too much concentration in our economy, in our institutions? Absolutely. That sentiment, I think, is absolutely correct, right? But to say just crypto writ large as this thing that's just solely governed, right? We're just replacing the bureaucracy of existing institutions with a new kind of Kafkaesque bureaucracy of the code, right? Because it's all about, I don't have any responsibility or accountability because these are the rules of this institution. Well, I don't have any ability to change any of this because, or follow your laws, because the code is just doing this. The code just works on its own. Oh, it's decentralized, right? So it's immutable. I don't control this, right? So there's that kind of lack of accountability in using the bureaucracy of the code as the excuse that worries me from that sociological argument. So for me, it's like, let's step that aside and just say, here's a set of tools. Is there concentration in various markets? Absolutely. How can we use tools, policies, regulatory frameworks to strengthen existing institutions that are already doing the work of financial inclusion, support them to be more competitive? If this reduces costs, makes things more efficient, great. If this allows them to open new markets, great, right? So I'm taking that kind of pragmatic approach, like what's the use case, what problems are we trying to solve, and let's actually build solutions for that rather than start with the ideology and push that.
Yeah. So when Humanity Cash decides to work with an entity, it's really about, do you support what that entity is doing outside of crypto, blockchain? Are they an institution that's worth being held up? And then can crypto and blockchain further support what they are doing?
Right. Just as you would choose any other tool in your toolkit to better achieve, the outcome that you're seeking.
Indeed. So have you seen blockchain and crypto work for local institutions, community-based institutions? What are the things that seem to be working? What are the challenges?
Yes. So, I mean, that's one of the areas where I think we've been kind of forward in that, and understanding that if you want this technology to actually be relevant in people's lives, you have to kind of make it invisible. It's not about selling people on a religion, right? Like, you're not converting them on a religion. Like, you must learn how to manage your own cryptographic keys and all of this stuff. Like, no, like, there is a reason why we want to pay for trusted parties and services to manage that, because they're in a bit better position to do that, right? So but the question is, can we for example, what we do, right, it's around local payments, working with community banks to hold underlying dollar deposits. We create digital tokens representing those dollars that then can be spent just like you would using digital cash, right? And that could help save merchants on the Visa MasterCard interchange fees, which is now pretty high. It's like 3 to 4%. All of my local businesses are offering cash discounts or passing on that 3% or 4% to me.
Yeah.
So that's one, right? Like, can we reduce some of that extractive nature? And then how do we help with deposit gathering for these community financial institutions? So that's what I'm excited about. And a lot of the population that we work with, they're very anti-crypto, I would say, for the most part. So for them, it's not about selling them on that. It's really selling people based on their values. Like, yeah, I want to support a better relationship with my money. I want to support a better, relationship with community institutions that are closer to me, they're therefore more trustworthy, maybe than a big bank or something. And can these tools allow those institutions to offer services parallel or in par or, better than the big banks, right? So that's what I'm kind of interested in doing. And I think more and more people are starting to see the value of that approach. But I still engage in a lot of ideological arguments with folks. They're like, yeah, we believe that, financial inclusion means teaching poor people how to manage their own keys. And it's like, whoa, like, is that really what they actually need?
Right. It's like those same efforts to like get poor people to, manage like the ledger on their checking account or whatever, without understanding that the problem they have is they don't have as much money as they need in the first place, right?
Right, exactly.
It's like not the technical skill, it's like actually a bigger problem. And I do see in your work and some of the materials you've shown on your homepage, kind of like an ecosystem approach to this, where it's not just like, I'm going to work with this one company to make them richer, but rather, how can supporting this one institution affect this other institution in that community? And how can that then be used to affect this other one, right? And it seems like you're connecting banking to local businesses at the very least, if not other aspects of the community.
Yes, yes. So like the concept of circular economies, or just there's a concept in monetary economics around the multiplier impact, or sometimes it's also called the velocity of money. So how fast does money move in a particular economic setting, stimulating more transactions and more economic activity. So if you look at the US dollar, the velocity of the US dollar is basically nil. It's very low. It's like 1.1. What that means is for every dollar that we drop into the US economy, it only facilitates $1.1 worth of economic transactions. So it's kind of like stuck, right? So in my theory of that is because we have such a heavily concentrated economy. If you spend that dollar with an Amazon doesn't really need to recirculate that money back as quickly because they're a big giant corporation. Maybe half the money goes offshore anyway, right? But if I spend that with the corner store, it's owned by a person. That person will need to spend it, and usually it's going to be in that same neighborhood because he or she may have more likely to have local employees, right? Or they'll spend it for their own needs, certainly, as part of their earnings, right? So you start to get more of that multiplier impact for that same dollar, and so that to me is kind of what's also kind of interesting from a policy standpoint, right? Because it's not just about the tech or this, it's like we have to also think about adjacent policies. So if we think about things like donations or cash relief and cash transfers, for example, after an emergency, or even with guaranteed income programs, if a portion of that were delivered in digital currency, what efficiencies can we get? Transparency, auditability, right? Less fraud. But if we also kind of intentionally directed people to spend money with the corner stores and the small businesses on Main Street, are we also, from a policy standpoint, getting more bang for our buck, right? So that same dollar, maybe it's helping, obviously helping a family in need, but it's also helping another family, that's running the corner bodega or other corner shops where you can get your basic needs fulfilled. And of course, holding all the underlying cash with a local bank that can then also use that as capital to distribute much needed loans to that local economy. So you get this nice kind of synergistic effect.
Yeah, it resonates a lot with the work that I've done in TV, even where you look at the budget of a TV show and it's like millions of dollars, right? But so much of that money is locked up at the very top of people who just put it in a bank account, or maybe they buy a house in Malibu, versus right. Like for much, much less on a local level, you'll see people making shows for nothing, but like all of that money goes right into the local economy. It goes right into like building everyone's portfolio. There's like so much value that goes like distributed when it's like super democratic in the way that it's used. So right. I'm curious about how you track that and how you incentivize people to go local, because I feel like it's so hard to be local these days. It's the hardest thing.
Yeah, it is really hard. So that's still a nut that needs to be cracked, and more innovation and thinking around it. We don't have all the answers yet. Starting for us, you start out with markets that are going to be more values ready, like values driven, right? They're the core sort of believers in this. Of course, there's marketing budget, right, where you can create incentives for people to shop locally. So businesses can also use these instruments as marketing and relationship development tools with their local customers, right? Hey, you're saving me on these card fees. I'm trying to create more of a personal connection, right? So it could be used in that way as social cohesion, marketing tools, etc. But I think there could be other ways in thinking about, well, where does value shift now? With credit cards, they incentivize users because they're from the fees that they're extracting from the small businesses, right? You can get your points and your cash back. So if we shift that away, like, are there other ways in which there are new beneficiaries that can then dividend back, for example, some kind of loyalty program, right? Maybe it's the banks, right? If they get the benefit of higher quality deposits that are stickier, which then they can actually use to make loans, right? And now it's a higher interest rate environment, and we're probably going to be staying in a higher interest rate environment for a while, right? So that could be another incentive, keeping your money invested locally. So there's different ways in I think thinking about how to incentivize that, but maybe it's also thinking about policy. So getting a local government to say, hey, we want to incentivize this as well, right? We're also going to use this local currency to facilitate payments, or if there's B2B connections, because that's also about encouraging B2B sales that are local, right? We could create our own local network, and maybe we can save on cash needs if we're all buying from each other, right? So it's just you can net all of our invoices, right, and save a bit of cash in times of stress. So there's these tools can, I think, be used in different ways, especially during times of perhaps stress, where people are going to get creative in how to support each other.
That's really interesting. And you mentioned interest rates, and I'm like, almost want to ask you about that, but then I'm like, this is not an economics podcast, so I'm not going to go into that. But when I hear you talk about your work, I feel like you are potentially on the forefront of 21st century finance. It does seem like it's super connected to the political and the cultural and the social. Like, you have this way in which you're seeing how all these things are integrated in a way that I think a lot of crypto fanatics don't. And it really makes me think about our political times in the United States, and how, yes, the dollar is strong right now, but with interest rates, and there's just a lot of political chaos. And I feel like I listen to some of these crypto podcasts, and I'm like, these guys want to start their own currency so they can start their own nation or something, and it freaks me out because because they're all white guys, it makes me feel like, oh my God, is this like the next frontier of white supremacy and fascism or something? So I'm curious if have you thought about that? And also, in general, if you don't, what does it mean for you to be a woman of color in this space when it seems like there's not that many?
Right. So another term that has been tossed around and requires definition, and is, I think, also intentionally left ambiguous, is DAO, right? The decentralized autonomous organization. So that this is the Kafkaesque bureaucracy part of all of this, right? So the idea of this DAO is like, okay, anonymous people on the internet come together, and they're making decisions, and then it's all going to be automated by smart contracts, right, facilitating these transactions. And therefore you can't really regulate this thing, because you can't really identify a single person that's responsible for these actions, right? So this kind of, again, denigrating accountability, right? This DAO is supposed to be self-executing on code, and it's supposed to be more democratic in its participation. And I have worked for a DAO, and I still don't really know what it is, but it just seems like people who don't want to take responsibility, right? Like, again, that legal accountability for their actions, because it's like, hey, it's the code, or it's the DAO, it's this thing of this collection of anonymous people and private keys that are signing transactions and smart contracts, effectuating transactions. It's not me, it's all, the machine, right? So it's this very technocratic view. And some of the political narrative around DAOs is that's supposed to be more democratic in its distribution of economic spoils, right? Like, or decision making. Everybody gets to vote, on what the smart contract does next, or so, how we change the code, how we upgrade the code, or other types of decisions that we want the code to implement, which are actually not technical in nature, but they're entirely social, right? To effectuate an action that humans want. And so the idea is participation and in more, I guess, equality in distribution of economic rights. And I would say, and of course, a lot of this is also around skirting securities laws and regulatory requirements for all these things, right? By saying, no, it's not, a single person responsible. But to me, this goes back to what you were saying earlier, more about content creation and some of the things we've talked about, right? Like, why are we just calling these cooperatives, right? Why aren't these mutuals, for example, right? There's, so that is fundamentally about ownership is attributed to either the labor itself or some other key stakeholder where there's an alignment. So you have mutual banks, and credit unions are similar, they're cooperatives where you remove the shareholder layer so that you can be directly aligned with the depositors, right? The people who are entrusting you with their money. Right. So that's, so we see examples of that in almost every industry, whether it's finance or agriculture or, creative space. And that sentiment, I absolutely 100% believe is necessary. We need more. We're never going to get rid of capitalism in this country, at least not anytime soon. But what we can push for is more of the stakeholder capitalism rather than shareholder capitalism, right? And so, but of course, DAOs can't be co-ops because then you can't have your shitcoin in there, right? So, but is it pointing to something that I think is legitimately needing? Yes. And this is where I think people of color need to come in and say, instead of being bamboozled by, well, I got to get in on crypto in order to get rich, right? And it's right, like, because look, the white guys are getting rich, so we need to get in on this game. We got to get in on this racket as well, right? I think our role is to say, step back, wait a minute, what we actually want to create is this, right? This kind of fairness, accountability, stakeholder alignment, right? And that's the valuable thing. And if these tools can be used to make it easier to do that, okay, right? But let's not forget what our actual values are, what our actual goals are, what the actual problems we're trying to solve for are.
Yeah, and I love how you talk about stakeholders versus shareholders, where, the problem of Web 2 is a lot of these big tech companies are publicly traded, so they're only focused on delivering quarterly returns to shareholders, buybacks and all that stuff, versus stakeholders is like, well, actually, you, social media company Meta, your stakeholders are not just shareholders, it's also your users, right? And that's a really diverse group of people who have a lot of diverse interests that maybe you should be investing in listening to for your long-term sustainability, which they clearly haven't done. And none of these companies really do that.
Right.
And I think when you talk about DAOs and decentralized autonomous organizations, which autonomous always also seems to be anonymous, it's like to actually work collectively, you need to know who you're working with,
right?
What their values are, what their needs are, what their goals are, and is there alignment there?
Right.
So it kind of seems like what you're kind of saying is, in order to have stakeholder capitalism, we need to know each other.
We absolutely need to know each other. You cannot, like, okay, so as a lawyer, right? The beauty of legal institutions that actually function is that it actually is reducing transaction costs at a systemic level, right? Because you have a legal system, we know there are rules that are going to be fairly applied, and it allows us to spread trust, right? So it allows me to operate at a larger level where maybe I don't have to personally trust everybody in the chain, but we can trust the legal model, we can trust the structure of contracts, we can trust, right? That's the ideal. Like, of course, our legal system is far from perfect, right? Again, that sentiment absolutely on point. But to say we're going to replace that with something that is merely just this autonomous code that's immutable, irreversible, right? Then it's like, well, we need a bit of the humanness in that too, right? Like there's concepts in law also around equity. What's equitable, right? Like the law is faceless to be fair, but it also needs a face sometimes to be fair. And crypto is just kind of saying, we're really damaged and we can't trust anything at all, except for, my computer games and my computer code and my algorithms.
Yeah, and I think that, when people of color, some people of color think about the law, they do think about this thing that imposes restrictions on their ability
Right.
to actually make it. And also a lot of those restrictions are just like financial, like it's just very
Yeah.
expensive to operate a legal business, especially if you want to grow it in the United States. So I do feel like there's an appeal in this space if some transactions, their dispensation and the rules can be automated, it can lower the costs
Right.
so that people of color can start new kinds of organizations and not be
Right.
saddled with all of the accounting and legal and compliance
Right.
stuff that precludes a lot of us from actually participating in capitalism. Is that kind of what you're
Yeah.
saying?
Yeah. So again, going back to some of the propaganda, right, which I really don't like, from the crypto industry, it preys exactly on this. It tells people of color, communities of color, the system has messed with you, right? Like you've been screwed by the system in all these ways. Here's this other shiny thing, but that shiny thing, the problem is that shiny thing has few protections for, so it's kind of preying, it's preying on those vulnerabilities. And that's where I think it's important to come in and say, we have to recognize that, yes, there are real problems to be solved. Let's figure out how to solve those problems. And again, if the tools can be used to make it easier to accomplish that, then great. But pushing the ideological narrative, I think, is what's so dangerous. And it is definitely a sign of the tense political times that we are in. Again, it's all technology is doing is reflecting the zeitgeist.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So I'm curious, as maybe to close out too on this vein, do you think that, having the identities that you have, and I'm not going to assume any of them, helps you in navigating this space? Does it help you talk to certain stakeholders and understand their perspective? Or are there ways in which you are designing Humanity Cash that you think is different from the mainstream crypto blockchain industry that is informed by your experiences in your life?
Oh, definitely the latter. I worked in extremely, white male environments. Remember, my first job was working on Wall Street. I talked to another woman who was very accomplished on Wall Street. She was, C-level titles. So I was like, okay, what she's saying validates what I'm saying. And she said, she had never experienced so much mansplaining until she worked in crypto. Because there's the sense that we can challenge everything now, right? Everything can be sort of challenged, all your existing knowledge of the world, it can all be turned upside down. And here's this brand new, shiny world we're going to create with these new set of tools. And so I think it's about taking our experience and saying there's what our wisdom is, knowing what things are like for people who are so far removed from the convenience of, I guess, thinking about ideology and getting rich while promoting ideologies, right? That's just like, how does this actually help an ordinary person in their life without needing them to spend all this time to understand crypto and these narratives, right? So I think definitely it's all my history, but it's also also that traditional work history has been useful, I think, in some aspects here to also say, okay, where is the pragmaticism, where is the groundedness, and where is the actual problem, use case, who you're trying to actually serve, and why isn't anyone trying to actually talk to them instead of pushing something onto them, versus just listening.
Yeah, I think that what you're describing, since maybe you didn't take courses in the literary humanities, is a kind of intersectional feminist practice. I mean, I think that like what intersectional feminism would say is that everyone's perspective is unique and also structured by the systems that they've had to navigate and have been oppressed by. And you have to talk to them and listen to them in order to understand what they've gone through in order to make any kind of intervention, right? And like what, Kimberly Crenshaw, when she coined the term intersectionality, her target was the law. And she was basically like, the law cannot actually interpret my experience as a Black woman. And here's these cases where the law is like focusing almost ideologically, right, on like just race or just gender, having this really narrow reading of the 14th Amendment and other various legal clauses, and right, how there's actually like life is more, point was kind of like, my life is complicated, right? And like
Right.
that complexity needs to be embedded into the law, right? My perspective needs to be embedded into the law in order for justice to happen. And it seems like you're kind of saying something like that.
Yeah, I mean, just on that, mandatory minimums take the humanists out of the law. Judges can no longer use discretion, right? Their powers and equity to say, this is what's fair for you as an individual, not just, well, you got to fit in this cog, and how do I compare you to that thing there and make it all balanced, right? And so that's one example in our criminal legal system. And of course, in our criminal system, we never go after white collar criminals, which is rampant in crypto, So, right. So there's all of that, like what we think is actually harmful to society and what we want to punish.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, mandatory minimums is such a good example because it's almost like a smart contract, right? It's like someone created a mutable, irreversible
It's
thing.
just the rule. You did this. You did this. This happens to you. This is it. No other space in between.
And that kind of inflexibility, when you're in an already just unjust society, really can do a lot more additional harm, even if that wasn't the original intent. So I think that really connects like this skepticism of decentralized governance and smart contracts. Like if you can imagine, for Black folks, like what autonomous governance is, if you have a law that was embedded in 1776, right? Like we're seeing the harmful effects of that now, right? And the slowness to change. So
it's originalism, right? You could think of like blockchain maxis, or they are quintessentially originalists, but for code and code as law, right?
Yeah, which is it's a harmful ideology, and one that I hope that we can not fall prey to in the future.
Active resistance, right? By creating alternatives, models that are actively showing the alternative.
Ashe, that is my gospel. Let's not just critique, let's actually build the thing we want. And I'm really proud of you, and I really just want to cheer you on for continuing to try to build the world that you want, while also being an expert in the thing, that everyone else is doing as well. It's a real, the work you do is super complex, and I don't fully understand it, but I think it's a model in general. Like what you've instructed to our audience here is the idea that in order to build a more equitable world, we have to build it. No one is going to build it for us, and certainly not the early investors in a particular technology.
Right. And the good news, to leave on a positive note, I think it's still really hard. I think for people of color, it's still really hard to build something outside of the narrative. And investors actually aren't creative people at all. They're not innovative people. They don't actually want to fund super innovative, experimental, meaningful, impactful work, right? They need to see what the returns are. But that said, it is more accessible probably now than ever in history to be able to try to build something. Tools are easier, right? So that is a benefit. Tools are easier to access, to build. So that is the good news.
Indeed. Let's end on that happy note. Thank you so much, Fennie, for taking the time to speak with me and our audience today.
Thank you for having me, Amar.